My family skipped my son's surgery, then asked me for $10,000. Mom texted me for wedding money days after my son's operation. I sent $1 instead of $10,000 and locked my accounts after ignoring my son's surgery. My family wanted cash. The bank manager called after I cut my family off financially. The monitor hummed a low, clinical drone, a sound that had become the heartbeat of my existence over the last 72 hours. I sat in a stiff, vinyl chair that smelled of industrial lemon and exhaustion, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my 7-year-old son's chest. Dylan looked so small in that hospital bed, his pale skin contrasting against the harsh white of the linens, a roadmap of tubes and wires connecting him to the machines that were keeping us both sane. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I stroked his hair, and I realized in that moment that the silence in the room wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the deafening roar of being completely and utterly alone. I had called everyone, my mother, my father, my sister Vanessa, begging for a familiar face, a hand to hold, or even just a cup of coffee brought by someone who loved us, but the silence on the other end of the line had been absolute. I am Carolyn, 34 years old, and I have spent my entire life being the responsible one, the daughter who was a rock so others could be the water. I built a career in the high-stakes world of finance, navigating market crashes and interest rate hikes with a steady hand, all while raising Dylan as a single mother. I thought I knew what stress was, but nothing prepares you for the sight of your child clutching his stomach, his face pinched in agony, whispering that it hurts too much to breathe. When the doctors told me it was acute appendicitis and that they needed to operate immediately, my world narrowed down to the size of a surgical suite. I did what I always do. I took charge, I handled the paperwork, and I reached out to my family, assuming that for once, the family helps family mantra they love to quote would actually apply to me. But as the hours turned into days, the only people who checked on me were my colleagues and the hospital staff. My parents, Martha and Frank, had excuses that sounded like bad sitcom plot lines, hair appointments, and gutter cleaning, while my younger sister, Vanessa, simply didn't answer. I sat in that waiting room, watching other families huddled together, sharing tears and sandwiches, while I clutched my phone like a lifeline that had been cut. It was 3 days into this nightmare, just as Dylan was finally starting to turn a corner, that I received a text message. It wasn't an inquiry about my son's recovery or an apology for their absence. It was a demand for $10,000. To understand how my own flesh and blood could be so breathtakingly cruel while their grandson lay in a hospital bed, you have to understand the architecture of the house I grew up in. We lived in a leafy, middle-class suburb of Chicago, the kind of place where lawns are manicured and secrets are kept behind heavy oak doors. From the time I was old enough to walk, I was the shadow to Vanessa's son. She was the golden child, a girl whose every stumble was treated like a tragic ballet and whose every whim was a command. Our childhood photo albums are a testament to this lopsided devotion. There's Vanessa in her shimmering dance costumes, my parents beaming in the background as if she had just discovered fire. There's Vanessa surrounded by a mountain of Christmas gifts, her face lit with the expectation of more. And then there's me. In the few photos I'm in, I'm usually the one holding the camera or standing off to the side, wearing a practical sweater and an expression of quiet observation. I learned early that my role was to be the stabilizer. If Vanessa broke a vase, I was the one who swept up the glass so she wouldn't cut her feet. If she failed a test, I was the one who tutored her so my parents wouldn't have to deal with her tantrums. By the time I was 16, I was working 30 hours a week at the local grocery store, bagging bread and scanning milk. It wasn't that my parents couldn't afford to give me an allowance. They just made it clear that while Vanessa's artistic soul needed nurturing, my practical nature meant I was perfectly capable of funding my own life. The real fracture happened during my senior year of high school. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the air smelling of my mother's burnt coffee and the faint scent of the lilac bushes outside. I pushed my acceptance letter from Northwestern across the table, my heart racing with a mixture of pride and terror. It was a dream school, a ticket to the life I wanted. My mother didn't even pick it up. She just stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. "We just don't have that kind of money set aside for you, Carolyn," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth she used when speaking to my sister. "We always figured you'd get scholarships or go somewhere less expensive." What she didn't say, but what the bank statements I'd eventually see confirmed was that every spare cent was being funneled into a future fund for Vanessa, who was still 2 years away from graduation and hadn't shown an ounce of academic interest. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply took out the loans, worked 3 jobs, and put myself through school. I graduated with a business degree and a chip on my shoulder the size of the Sears Tower. Meanwhile, Vanessa floated through 3 different universities over 6 years, changing her major from theater to life coaching to interior design, all on my parents' dime. Every time she dropped out, they moved her into a new, more expensive apartment to help her find herself. My first job was as a bank teller, a humble start that required me to live in a studio apartment so small I could touch both walls if I stretched. I remember the day I got my first promotion to personal banking associate. I was 22, glowing with the thrill of moving up the ladder. I called home, hoping for a well done or maybe even an invite to dinner. My mother picked up, but I could hear boxes being taped in the background. "That's nice, dear," she said distractedly. "Listen, I have to go. Vanessa decided she hates her current place, and we're helping her move into that new loft downtown. Can you call back next week?" That was the pattern of my life. My achievements were footnotes. Vanessa's inconveniences were headlines. When I met Brian at 25, I thought I had finally found a partner who valued my strength. He was charming and ambitious, or so he seemed. We married in a small, elegant ceremony that I paid for myself. My parents spent the entire reception complaining that it was too modest and that they had always imagined a proper wedding for their daughters, meaning, of course, the one they intended to throw for Vanessa. When Dylan was born, I thought maybe a grandchild would change things. I was at the peak of my career, having just been promoted to financial advisor at a top-tier firm. But Brian couldn't handle the reality of a crying infant or a wife who was more successful than he was. By the time Dylan was 2, the divorce was final. Brian stayed in the picture just enough to fulfill his legal obligations, but the emotional heavy lifting was all mine. And then there were Dylan's health issues. He was born with a heart murmur and a fragile respiratory system. The medical bills were staggering, but I handled them. I always handled it. But my family saw my competence not as a sign of hard work, but as a resource to be tapped. Over the years, I became the family ATM. It started small, covering a bill here, a car repair there. Then it escalated. When my parents took out a second mortgage to pay for yet another of Vanessa's failed career launches, I was the one who helped them refinance and covered the $5,000 in closing costs. That was money I had saved for Dylan's first trip to Disney World. Then came Vanessa's credit card debt, $12,000 spent on designer clothes and wellness retreats she couldn't afford. My parents called me, sobbing, saying she was fragile and afraid of debt collectors. Like a fool, I stepped in. I set up a plan. I paid for the first 4 months. Family helps family, Carolyn, my mother would say whenever I dared to ask why no one ever called to ask how Dylan's checkups went. You're just better with money. It comes easy to you. It didn't come easy. It came from 60-hour work weeks. It came from skipping meals so Dylan could have the best soccer cleats. It came from the marrow of my bones. Which brings us back to that hospital room. When Dylan's stomach pain started, I knew it wasn't just a bug. I saw the way his small hand gripped his side. I saw the color drain from his lips. In the ER, when the surgeon, Dr. Bennett, told me they had to go, and right then, I felt a chasm open up beneath me. I stood in that sterile hallway, my hands shaking so hard I dropped my phone twice, and I called my mother. I told her grandson was going into surgery. I told her I was scared. "Oh, honey," she said, and for a second, I thought I heard genuine concern. Then she continued, "Today I have my standing hair appointment at 11, and your father was going to clean the gutters. The weather is so nice, we really need to get them done before the rain." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Mom, he's having emergency surgery. The gutters can wait." "Well, let me talk to your father," she sighed, sounding genuinely inconvenienced. "Don't be so dramatic, Carolyn. Appendectomies are routine. We'll see what we can do." She never showed up. Vanessa never even returned the call. I sat in that waiting room for 2 hours, watching the clock, surrounded by strangers who were more supportive than my own blood. A nurse named Janet brought me coffee because she saw me trembling. She didn't even know my name, but she saw my humanity when my parents couldn't. When Dylan finally came out of surgery, groggy and pale, the first thing he asked was, "Is Grandma here?" I had to lie. I had to look into my 7-year-old's innocent eyes and tell him they sent their love, while my phone sat in my pocket with nothing but a thumbs-up emoji from my mother and a meme from my sister. The next 48 hours were a blur of sleeplessness and simmering resentment. I slept in a recliner that felt like it was made of rocks, working on my laptop between Dylan's naps because, as a single mom, I couldn't afford to lose the billable hours. I watched the nurses change his bandages. I held his hand when the pain meds wore off. And, through it all, not a single member of my family walked through that door. No flowers. No, "Can I bring you a sandwich?" Nothing. By Friday afternoon, when I finally wheeled Dylan out to the car, something inside me had shifted. The responsible daughter who always said yes was dying, replaced by a mother who realized her son was watching. He was learning that his needs were secondary to his aunt's whims and his grandparents' convenience. As I buckled him into his car seat, he looked at me and asked, "Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at me, Mommy? Is that why they didn't come?" My heart didn't just break, it shattered into a million jagged pieces. I realized then that my help wasn't supporting my family, it was subsidizing their cruelty. Sunday morning should have been a time of healing. Dylan was home, eating pancakes and watching cartoons, the color finally returning to his cheeks. But then the phone chimed. It was a text from my mother. "How is Dylan?" she asked. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she felt guilty. Maybe she was finally coming around. I told her he was better. Then the second text arrived, and the flicker of hope was extinguished by a bucket of ice water. "Good to hear. Listen, we need to talk about something important. Vanessa is engaged. Tyler proposed last night. She needs $10,000 for her dream wedding dress. Vera Wong. Once in a lifetime. The boutique is holding it but needs a deposit by tomorrow. Can you transfer the money today? Family helps family." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. $10,000. For a dress. 3 days after they abandoned their grandson in a hospital bed. I looked at Dylan, who was happily stacking Legos on the rug, oblivious to the fact that his family saw his life-saving surgery as a minor drama that shouldn't interfere with a shopping trip. The audacity was so profound it almost felt like a hallucination. My father called 5 minutes later. He didn't ask about Dylan's incision. He didn't ask how I was holding up after 3 days of no sleep. "Carolyn," he said, his voice gruff and demanding. "Did you see the message? Tyler's parents are wealthy, and we can't have Vanessa looking like a pauper. This dress is a necessity. We know you have the money tucked away." "Dad," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I have medical bills. I missed work. My son was in the hospital. We've all been busy, Carolyn," he snapped. "Don't be selfish. This is your sister's big day. You're the only one who can make this happen." As I hung up the phone, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a vending machine. And it was time to pull the plug. I sat down at my laptop, my fingers flying over the keys. As a financial advisor, I knew exactly how to protect myself. I knew where every cent of my money was, and more importantly, I knew where their access ended. I had spent years building a safety net for people who wouldn't even bring me a cup of water in a crisis. I looked at the joint emergency fund I had set up for my parents years ago. I saw the unauthorized withdrawals they'd been making for Vanessa's shopping trips. My blood boiled, but my mind stayed sharp. I didn't just see a betrayal, I saw a solution. I began the process of freezing every account they had a name on. I began the process of moving my life out of their reach. And as I did, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The storm was coming, I knew that. My mother's tears and my father's rage were only a phone call away. But as I looked at Dylan, I knew I wasn't just saving my money. I was saving my son from a legacy of being second best. The air in my office felt thick, pressurized by the silence that followed my mother's dismissive wave. She looked at me not as a daughter who had just endured a traumatic week, but as an obstacle standing between her and a piece of expensive lace. Small expenses, she had called the thousands of dollars they had drained from the account I built for their old age. Nothing worth bothering you about. I felt a cold shiver of clarity. "Dylan had emergency surgery last week," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through her bravado like a blade. "None of you came. Not for an hour. Not for a minute." My son, your grandson, asked me if you were mad at him because the bed next to his was filled with grandparents and his was empty. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something resembling shame behind her eyes, a ghost of the mother I wished she was. But then, the mask of indignation snapped back into place. We were busy, Carolyn. And hospitals are depressing. We send our love, isn't that enough? A text message isn't support, Mom, I countered, standing my ground. Being there in a crisis is support. A $10,000 wedding dress is a luxury, not an emergency. That was the spark that set the room on fire. Her voice rose to a screech that I was certain my colleagues could hear through the heavy oak door. She paced the small space of my office, her finger wagging at me as she dug up every perceived slight from the last 30 years. She accused me of being the jealous sister, of trying to sabotage Vanessa's one special moment because I was bitter about my own failed marriage. She called me ungrateful for sacrifices I knew I had actually paid for myself. Finally, she reached for the nuclear option. If you don't fix this right now, she hissed, her face inches from mine, you can consider yourself no longer part of this family. A strange thing happens when someone threatens to cast you out of a burning building. You realize you'd rather be outside in the cold than stay and stifle. Is that the price of admission, Mom? I asked, my voice eerily calm. Is family just a financial transaction to you? Because if withdrawing my checkbook means I'm not family, then what were you when you ignored your grandson's surgery? Were you already not acting like family then? She had no answer, only a huff of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed her designer bag and marched to the door. This isn't over. Your father will be calling. You have until noon. And don't bother coming to Sunday dinner anymore. When the door slammed, I sank into my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt like I had just survived a car wreck, shaken, but alive. My assistant, Lauren, peeked in a few minutes later with a look of pure sympathy. Everything okay? The whole floor heard the Sunday dinner part. I gave her a tired smile. Just a restructuring of the family portfolio, Lauren. Nothing I can't handle. But my parents weren't done. By lunchtime, my phone was a war zone. My father's missed calls piled up like cordwood. Vanessa's texts devolved from please, sis, to you're a selfish B*TCH who wants me to be miserable. I muted them all, but the real blow came at 1:15 p.m. when Robert, my contact at the bank, called me with an urgent tone. Carolyn, I'm calling as a friend and a professional, Robert said. Your parents were just here. They tried to override the freeze on the joint account. They told my staff you were having a mental health crisis and weren't in a rational state to manage your finances. They even tried to file a fraud report against you for moving the funds. I felt the blood drain from my face. They did what? I shut it down, of course, Robert continued. I told them that as the primary funder and account holder, you were perfectly within your rights. But they mentioned contacting your firm's management to warn them about your behavior. I thought you should be prepared. I thanked him, my hand trembling as I hung up. This wasn't just a squabble over a dress anymore. This was an attempt to dismantle my life. I didn't wait for them to strike. I marched straight into my supervisor Nancy's office and laid it all out. Nancy, a woman who had navigated the shark-infested waters of finance for 30 years, listened with a grim expression. If they call, Carolyn, I'll handle it. Your performance is impeccable. Don't let them get in your head. By the time I picked up Dylan from school, I was emotionally haggard, but my spine was made of steel. That evening, my father finally got through. Family meeting. 7 p.m. Our house, he barked. I can't, Dad. Dylan is still recovering. Then bring him. This ends tonight. He hung up before I could argue. I knew if I didn't go, this would shadow me forever. I called my neighbor, Miss Jenkins, who stepped in like the grandmother Dylan actually deserved. Then I spent an hour at my printer. I didn't bring tears to this meeting, I brought data. I gathered every bank statement, every loan agreement, every text message asking for just a few hundred to get by. I built a spreadsheet that told the true story of our family, a decade of exploitation totaling over $53,000. Driving to my childhood home felt like driving toward a courtroom. When I walked in, the air was thick with hostility. My father was in his throne, the velvet recliner. Vanessa was on the sofa next to a tall, polished man in a tailored suit whom I recognized from photos as her fiancé, Tyler. He looked deeply uncomfortable, like a man who had realized he'd walked into the wrong movie. Sit, my father commanded, pointing to a lone dining chair placed in the center of the room. The hot seat. I remained standing. I'm not here to be bullied, I said, my voice projecting with the authority I used in boardrooms. I'm here to discuss a pattern of exploitation. I am not an ATM, and I am not a second-class citizen. Exploitation. Vanessa shrieked, jumping up. You're talking about my wedding. You're ruining my life over a dress. It's not about the dress, Vanessa, I said. Turning to Tyler. Did they tell you why I froze the account? Did they tell you that while my 7-year-old was in the hospital having emergency surgery last week, my parents were withdrawing money from my emergency fund to pay for wedding favors? Without telling me. Tyler's eyes widened. What emergency account? Vanessa, you said your sister was just being difficult about a gift. I handed him a copy of my spreadsheet. I've given this family $53,000 in 10 years. I paid for Vanessa's credit card debt twice. I paid the closing costs when my parents refinanced this house to fund another one of Vanessa's failed business ventures. And last week, when I needed them most, they couldn't even bring my son a teddy bear because they were too busy gutter cleaning and hairstyling. The room went silent. I watched the color drain from Vanessa's face as Tyler read the numbers. $10,000 for a dress? Tyler whispered, looking at his fiancée. You told me your budget was $2,000. You told me your sister was paying for it as a thank you for all you've done for her. I did what? I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. What exactly has Vanessa done for me, Tyler? Aside from ignoring my son's surgery. Vanessa turned on me, her face contorted with a venom I had never seen. Stop it. Stop trying to make him hate us. You've always been jealous. You've always known Mom and Dad love me more because I'm not a cold, calculating robot like you. The silence that followed was deafening. The truth, ugly and naked, sat in the middle of the room. My father looked at the floor. My mother looked at her nails. They didn't deny it. They couldn't. I may be a robot to you, I said, my heart feeling lighter with every word, but this robot is officially out of service. I'm not cutting you off entirely, but the Bank of Carolyn is closed. There will be no more money. No more bailouts. If you want a relationship with me or Dylan, it will be based on respect and presence, not my bank balance. Tyler stood up, looking at me with genuine regret. Caroline, I had no idea. I'm so sorry about your son. I think you're absolutely right. I walked out of that house without looking back. As I drove away, the suburban lights seemed brighter. I felt a weight fall away that I had carried since I was 6 years old. 2 months have passed. The healing has been quiet and steady. Dylan is back to his old self, his scar fading into a thin silvery line that he calls his warrior mark. My family's reaction was exactly what my therapist, Dr. Morgan, predicted, a silent treatment that lasted weeks. But I didn't mind the silence. It was peaceful. It gave me time to renovate my kitchen and plan a vacation that was just for us, no family obligations, just the sun and the sand. The first crack in the ice came a month ago. A letter from Vanessa. Tyler had postponed the wedding. He wanted financial transparency and premarital counseling. She didn't exactly apologize, but she admitted she hadn't been the aunt she should have been. Then came a birthday card for Dylan from my parents, containing a gift card and a tentative invite for ice cream. I haven't said yes yet. I'm moving slowly, protecting my peace like the precious asset it is. I've realized that I don't need their validation to be a good daughter. I just need to be a great mother. Last night, as Dylan and I sat on our new hardwood floors building a Lego castle, he looked up at me and said, "Mommy, you seem happy." I kissed the top of his head. I am, buddy. We're finally building something that's going to last. Watching Dylan navigate his own small world with a clarity I hadn't possessed at his age was the final confirmation I needed. As he sat there, clutching that action figure and explaining his playground negotiations, I realized that the cycle of exploitation ended with me. I wasn't just guarding a bank account, I was guarding his understanding of what it means to be loved. I looked at his small, determined face and felt a surge of protective pride that eclipsed every ounce of guilt my parents had ever tried to instill in me. Love, real love, doesn't demand that you hollow yourself out to fill someone else's pockets. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet, steady reconstruction of our lives. I took the money that had been earmarked for a dress Vanessa would have worn once and moved it into Dylan's high-yield college savings account, feeling a profound sense of justice with every click of the mouse. That money represented thousands of hours of my life, and now it finally belonged to my son's future instead of my sister's vanity. I also finalized the renovations on our home. The new hardwood floors gleamed under the kitchen lights, and the fresh paint on the walls seemed to absorb the lingering echoes of the arguments that used to haunt our halls. Our home no longer felt like a staging ground for family crises. It felt like a sanctuary. My relationship with my parents and Vanessa remains in a state of fragile, distant peace. We've met for ice cream twice now. Both times, I set a strict 1-hour timer and kept the conversation light: school, the weather, Dylan's soccer goals. When my mother started to veer toward the topic of Vanessa's struggles with Tyler, I simply smiled and redirected the conversation back to Dylan's drawings. The look of frustration on her face was familiar, but it no longer had the power to make me flinch. I am no longer the fixer. I am a guest in their lives, and they are guests in mine. Vanessa and Tyler are still in counseling, and from what I hear, she is finally learning the word budget. Whether their marriage happens or not is no longer my burden to carry. I have found a new kind of wealth in the peace of my own home, in the reliability of friends who show up with soup when I'm tired, and in the laughter of a son who knows his mother will always have his back. I've learned that you can't buy a seat at a table where you aren't respected, and you shouldn't want to. Today, my life is smaller, quieter, and infinitely richer. I am Carolyn, I am a mother, and for the first time in my life, I am finally enough just as I am.